Now I call upon Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Vice Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs, to make his presentation.
Good evening. I won't, given the time constraints, I'll be fast, but I'll make a few points. You know, Professor Samford neatly showed what the myopias of different disciplines are. He spoke about what the legal scholar looks at, what the political scientist looks at, what the economist looks at, and of course it's the classic story of the blind man and the elephant. Now, I'm one of the blind men, being a political scientist, and since there will be others who will follow me who are economists and legal scholars and business studies scholars, I will take the the political scientists' lenses and put forward some thoughts about corruption and unethical behavior on a transnational scale. By transnational, I mean where the number of actors go beyond nation states and involve at least one or more non-state actors. Right? And talking of non-state actors, there has been no bigger force over the last 30 years of so-called globalization than corporations. Right? So it's impossible to speak about transnational corruption in this day and age without talking about the involvement of businesses in the promotion of unethical behavior across regions, and of course involving close and tight-knit relationships with state elites. So let me identify a few sectors where I believe transnational corruption is quite rampant. The first one is natural resources, and here you have the so-called rentier states, which have been spoken about and written about for years now. The rentier state is basically a state which has given away a franchise to a foreign corporation, which is allied with local capitalist powers, and which then you have a triangular relationship. So it's given a franchise to extracting, say, minerals or precious metals or commodities. It can even be agriculture produce. And so this relationship of the rentier state, you see a lot of it in parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so especially so because the governing structures are weak and the state's elites are often on the lookout for making a fast buck through an alliance with global capital. So the natural resource sector, you have this was identified very early on in the 1970s by Cardozo and the Latin American political economists, where they call this dependent development. Huge source of corruption across transnational spaces. Dependent development, where you have the foreign multinational, the local corporate partners, and the state elites. All three of them, hand in glove, in extracting, exploiting, and eventually appropriating what belongs to the people, the natural resources. Right? That's one. The second one, the holiest of all cows, is the defense sector. Defense has not been touched enough because of the obvious argument of official secrets and national security, which are often seen as beyond the purview of the general public, because states are in competition and they cannot reveal everything. As you know, procurement in defense sector has involved massive corruption across the world. It's probably the most corrupt sector, and it will be interesting to get a value from an economist about the billions or trillions of dollars that have been spent and have changed hands through kickbacks and through procurements which are very, very opaque in the defense sector. So as you are aware, there are many countries have Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and such things to try and prevent their own corporations from going out and securing deals through bribery. And in fact, you've had a number of sting operations in the US last year, where a number of defense dealers have been found to be involved in bribing government officials of Asia, Africa, and Latin America to try and sell them equipment for military purposes. So the opaqueness of it, there's another angle to the defense sector, which is if you had followed the WikiLeaks cables about how the United States and Europe and the European Union have also in many ways used their diplomatic resources in order to sell weapons for their respective titans, Boeing in the case of the Americans and the EADS in the case of Europe. And you will see, for example, amazing revelations about how the Americans retrofitted the planes of the Saudi monarchy in return for Boeing getting a contract for its latest fighter jets worth 10 or 15 billion dollars. So is this not bribery? Clearly it is. But at the same time, a number of these advanced countries speak about having robust or improving their foreign corrupt practices acts and enforcing them, and basically holding their companies to with the feet to the fire for spreading the menace of transnational corruption. The third sector I want to talk about are drugs. As you know, the war on drugs in Mexico has cost 35,000 lives in the last 6 years. I was speaking to some Mexican diplomats recently, and they were talking about how the responsibility for this cannot simply be left to weak governance structures or to state failure in Mexico. The problem is deeper. It crosses the border. And the problem is about laundering of weapons, but even bigger, laundering of money involving Wall Street banks. So how many deaths in Mexico are accounted for by Wall Street? These are the kind of questions we need to ask as a result of transnational corruption. I want to stick to the theme of business corruption because the perception is widespread that markets are now dominant over the state globally. Susan Strange wrote about it in the 1970s and 80s when international political economy had just come around. But today there is a consensus that the so-called globalization has had this huge downside where markets are dominant and markets often determine public policies. There has been in many ways a reversal of this trend since 2008, with some people claiming that the market itself has now ended, which is the obverse. Ian Bremmer has just written a book called The End of the Market, and where he talks about how state capitalism is different from free market capitalism, is now dominant. And Anatol Kaletsky, another scholar I want to mention, written a book called Capitalism 4.0, where he talks about how states are now once again reasserting themselves. So here's an opportunity. Government is needed. Professor Samford said we do need government. And here's an opportunity where the state is retaking some of its lost space from corporate giants as a result of the crisis. But if it is business as usual and people talk about recovery and rebound, will this momentum be sustained, or will it go back to free market corporate globalization, which has produced much of this transnational corruption? So I also want to leave you with a thought from economic history about how people talk about early or middle phases of modernization and how this generates high levels of corruption and inequalities. The economists use the phrase Kuznets curve for how when there is high growth early on and when economies are industrializing, you have high levels of corruption. And then over time, they say time means, they're looking at long horizon, 50, 60 years. Inequalities decline. That's the Kuznets curve. Is there a Kuznets curve for corruption? There probably is, because what happens is that when robber baron capitalism and crony capitalism expands and becomes massive and becomes a major burden on society, there will be a reaction. And then what you'll have are crashes, for example. So the Gilded Age in America of the 1880s and 1890s was followed by the Depression 40 years later, where they created Securities and Exchange Commission to at least regulate these robber baron capitals. So crony capitalism seems to be symptomatic of early and middle modernizing societies. And so a number of Asian, African, Latin American countries today are in that stage. And so is it our common fate to all be subject to robber baron capitalism? Are we all going through our respective Gilded Ages? That's a question. But the problem with economic history, it gives you fantastic parallels and across time, but and across space. The problem with it is it's mostly analytical. It doesn't give you as many solutions. And so we cannot just rest on economic history. I want to end by referring to John Stuart Mill's famous quote that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We need stronger citizen activism and collective mobilization. And it sounds cliched, but there is no other way. It's the simple solution to the most complex problem. Thank you.